I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Charlie Zolli, Chair, and this is the Metropolitan Council Committee of the Whole meeting on Wednesday, February 2nd. Happy Groundhog Day. But first, I'll give a few logistics. This is a digital meeting, and we're doing it under auspices of Minnesota statutes, section 13D.021. And if there's any members of the public listening or watching and you have comments, I encourage you to email us at public.info@metc.state.mn.us, and we'll respond to your comments in a timely manner. And in order to establish quorum, I will invite Bridget to call the roll.
Councilmember Barber.
Here.
Chambliss.
Here.
Fredson.
Here.
Gonzalez.
Here.
Johnson. Johnson.
Here.
Lee.
Here.
Lilligren.
Here.
Lindstrom.
Here.
Muse.
Here.
Sterner.
Here.
Vento.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Zarin.
Present.
Chair Zelli.
I'm here. We have a quorum. The first item is to approve the agenda. We have two interesting information items. And unless I hear any amendment or disagreement, I will consider the agenda approved, which brings us to the minutes from our meeting, Committee of the Whole, January 19th, 2022. And if there, unless there's any corrections, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Wolf moves approval.
Sterner seconds.
Thank you, council members. Any discussion? If not, Bridget, please call the roll.
Councilmember Barber.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings. Fredson.
Aye.
Gonzalez.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Muse.
Aye.
Sterner.
Aye.
Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Zarin.
Aye.
Chair Zelli.
Aye. Those minutes are approved. So as I mentioned, we have two items I've been looking forward to. And the first is about housing tools and locally identified housing needs. We're going to hear from Hillary Lovelace in a minute, but to help set up this conversation is our one and only Community Development Director, Lisa Barras. Lisa.
Thank you, Chair Zelli. Thank you, council members. It's good to see you this evening. And as part of our continued work, I don't know, Greg, if you could bring up the presentation for us. I'll just run through our first couple of slides. Thank you. And we can just skip to that next slide. Excuse me, next slide, please. Sorry, go back one. So as part of our work across the council, and you'll remember over this last year and a half or so, is that council staff have been reporting to you on a number of different items as an early part of our 2050 regional planning process. So you might remember when we talked to you last December and November that we discussed some of these core questions that we ask in regional planning. Where are we today? Where do we want to go? How do we want to get there? And what are the barriers or opportunities for achieving our vision? So today we're bringing that additional reporting on where we are today. This is a foundation or building our foundation based on what we're seeing in our comprehensive plans as a core component of that foundation. This helps set the stage for what you might need to know for the upcoming work on the next regional development guide. And today we will continue that reporting out on what we found in those plans. Comprehensive plans share complex positions from different geographies and community types from across the region, evolving programs and ideas, innovative approaches to issues or challenges, and emerging priorities. That includes acknowledging unknowns and uncertainties as well. It's a wealth of information that sets us up to understand where communities are now, what the consolidated regional plan looks like, if you will, when you put all of those plans together as one, so that we can better understand what the region's challenges will be in 2050 and how we accomplish those or tackle those challenges. Next slide, please. So when we first came before you last April to share out high-level themes or headlines from that analysis of 2040 plans, we covered a number of different items. We know that local plans reflect regional policies, but we also provided a big picture overview showing how local plans reflected other policies, and particularly related to regional systems of transportation, water resources, regional parks, and also land use, some headlines around housing and natural resources, where the council's policies provide direction to those local planning efforts. We've also shared analysis on elements related to climate change, public health, and most recently around aging. Today, Hillary is going to talk to you about housing and give you a more in-depth analysis on what she and the team have found in the review of 2050 plans. I'm sorry, 2040 plans. I don't need to get ourselves a decade ahead of where we are today. So with that, I will turn it over to Hillary, and she'll give you the deep dive on how communities are planning for housing in the region.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Can everybody hear me? Just want to do a quick check. Yes, great. If you could bring us to the next slide, please, Greg. Thank you. My presentation today is going to be in 4 parts, or 2 parts of 2. If you all would like, or if you have a lot of questions after this second section on land guided for affordable housing, I'll stop for a couple of questions, and then I'll take the rest of the questions at the end. Just because we're in this current virtual meeting era, I'm looking for any opportunity to interject a little bit more natural and normal conversation and interaction. So if you've got a little clarification request, you want to just turn on your camera and wave at me, I can pause. We can go through it. Next slide, please, Greg. So requirements to be found complete and consistent for comprehensive plan review, which are 2 different standards for housing review and 2040 comprehensive plans, were substantially different than in prior decades, as local roles in regional housing outcomes were re-examined as part of rewriting the housing policy plan for the first time in about 30 years. Our area of review on housing was reported to be one of the most difficult that communities tackled in their comprehensive plan debrief work. That LPA reported on just a few weeks ago in CDC, in part because with anything new, there's a learning curve and there are some challenges. One of the more highlighted areas of comprehensive plan review in this cycle were the identification of local housing needs. The table on the right shows the regional allocation of need for a hypothetical community, which is tied to this community's growth in the 2021 to 2030 decade. But communities were also asked separately to go above and beyond this and to identify their own local housing needs. Some communities tried to update their plans from the last decade with new information, which fell short of meeting our new requirements for this decade cycle. Other communities took the opportunity to deeply consider their role in housing and their comprehensive planning efforts. Some communities strategically chose to point their focus on other areas of their plan and just wanted the housing section to cuss the mustard, not to rewrite the game. On the other hand, other communities really took their housing section seriously and put a lot of work into writing a section that was actionable for the next decade, as we've seen with a couple of communities. So there was really a wide variability in identification of local needs, but 2 commonalities that we saw are that a lot of communities focused on the needs of older adults when they were naming their locally identified needs, and also their desire to build environmentally conscious or green or sustainable housing as it relates to their local housing needs. Whether that was in the form of retrofits or in new construction, communities talked about that a lot. Housing is important to communities in this decade in a way that it previously wasn't. That's not all because of our requirements, but it's much because of a political shift outside of our efforts that reflected that and that was reflected in comprehensive plans. For instance, some communities with a sizable amount of manufactured housing that was mostly ignored as part of their housing stock in their 2030 plans, was a huge focus in their 2040 plans. Both Little Canada and the city of Blaine put substantial sections within their housing comprehensive plan work on what not only the existing needs of manufactured home communities within their cities, but also the city's role and what they were going to try and explore in the next decade that they could do to help residents in manufactured home communities. So there was a giant shift there. To allow communities flexibility in how they chose to guide land to meet statutory requirements, because there's such a range of community characteristics across community designations, communities were given an option to choose to either guide land at minimum densities of 8 units per acre to meet their allocation of regional affordable housing need for the 2021 to 2030 decade, or in a combination of 6 and 12 units per acre. Only 14 communities chose to follow what we call option 2 for land guided for affordable housing. In that case, the 12 units per acre was to meet need at 50% or less of area median income, or those in the lower affordability bands, and the 6 units per acre was for 51 to 80% of AMI. Next slide, please, Greg. On this slide, we're going to review some basics about land guided for affordable housing. And if anyone who reads the housing section of our staff reports that I lovingly craft for every authorized comprehensive plan that has expected growth in this planning decade, you may be familiar with this table. Guiding land uses with minimum densities high enough to support the development of each community's affordable housing need is a requirement for consistency with the housing policy plan and as related to participation in LCA. We used minimum densities in this work, and we acknowledge that in many housing cycles and in community designations within our region, it's becoming less and less common that multifamily housing is built to the minimum density specified for any given land use. The calculation in our table provides a low estimate of the possible units if we assume that all acres of available development for the 2021 to 2030 decade are built out. Each staff report for a community with a plan shown to the council has approval has included this table, which shows that communities generally have guided enough land to support their affordable housing need for the next decade. In review of comprehensive plans, communities could choose to meet their land guided for affordable housing with mixed use land uses as long as they specified an expected or minimum amount required of residential land within that mixed use land use. For instance, in this community's example, they may choose to guide a land use with an expected residential development of 67% mixed and call it mixed use with a minimum density of 12 units per acre. Next slide, please, Greg. Thanks. One issue we've identified pretty early on after the adoption and authorization of plans is that it was difficult for communities, electeds, and advocates to keep track of land guided for affordable housing as amendments came in. So we've been working to move this static table that you've seen in reports into an online interactive table. Anyone will be able to see these at any time to see how much land is guided high enough at densities to support affordable housing on a community by community basis within the community pages section of our local planning handbook online. It's not there yet, so don't go looking quite yet. Annually, the units of affordable housing developments ready for occupancy will be added to this table. And as amendments to comprehensive plans come in and are authorized by the council, this information will update in the same way that forecast information and affordable housing need allocation update currently on community pages. Our tracking of land guided for affordable housing won't only be shown on our website, but can be analyzed over time. So look forward to some interesting data on how land guided for affordable housing changes over time in the future where affordable housing is developed and how land guided for affordable housing supports that development. Next slide, please, Greg. This chart is one you've seen before if you remember Mike Larson's presentation from last April. I'm sure everybody remembers last April, perfectly crystal clear. This chart identifies the composite affordable housing allocation by community designation in those long gray bars. The yellow and blue bars are a breakdown of that capacity by residential and mixed use districts, respectively. Similar to the overall land use analysis, we're looking at the ways in which communities consider how they're going to meet their affordable housing need between a mixture of residential guided land and mixed use guided land. One thing this chart obscures a little bit that I wanted to point out and I find particularly interesting is that each suburban edge community by themselves, third down from the top, relies on mixed use districts to meet their minimum. It's not just one community that relies on a lot, but I see that as a pretty big shift from the last decade. We're keeping our eye on information on like what portion of land is guided as mixed use versus solely residential, because it's interesting to see where affordable housing will develop among community designations and land use types during this coming decade. It'll also be interesting to track how much land guided at residential versus mixed use actually develops affordable housing over this decade. So I'll pause here for any questions, but I'm not seeing a lot of faces, so maybe we'll just keep going to the next slide, Greg. We'll roll on into housing tools. Widely available tools that cities have to meet their local housing needs were described in detail in resources we created on the local planning handbook on the website. Communities are asked to go further in this area than they were in previous housing sections of comprehensive plans, where most comprehensive plans just listed tools available to them to meet their needs in the past. Communities were challenged to go further and consider if and when they would use these tools to meet their locally identified housing needs. So these nearly 30 tools that we listed as widely available tools to meet communities' needs fell into 4 main buckets. The first being local sources of funding. So this includes things like local housing bonds, which many communities issue not only for their own development, but for neighboring communities' development within our region, tax abatement, and tax increment financing. The next kind of bundle is resources for funding development outside of a community's own coffers. So that includes our own Livable Communities Act dollars that we as the council distribute. That includes Minnesota housing funds and also county federal pass-through funds like CDBG and home dollars. Next group is about local policies and strategies. So this really ranges from things like site assembly, where the city has a large role in bringing land together for a larger development, effective referrals, which is kind of on the other side of that, where city staff are just versed in how to forward requests from community members, whether it's about foreclosure assistance or home maintenance problems. And then rental licensing and inspection programs, which are kind of the bread and butter of a lot of cities' work in our region. The last section is about preservation strategies and partnerships, which includes things like local 4D programs, which allow a lower tax rate to not only affordable housing development, but for landlords that pledge to keep their rents low for a specific amount of time. A couple of cities around our region have adopted local 4D programs, and also partnerships with outside groups like community land trusts in order to preserve housing that currently is not subsidized but has low rents. Next slide, please, Greg. We acknowledge that housing requirements were more robust in this decennial review than in previous decennial reviews. And this requirement built upon an element most communities saw as an opportunity to copy and paste. This time we worked with communities to explain that the requirement asked them to go further, and again, to mention if and when they would consider the use of a tool to meet their locally identified housing needs. There was a big learning curve and lots of confusion. Communities that had a history of using tools to solve their local housing problems were proud to state the tools that they had used before and plan to continue to use in the future to meet any anticipated needs that they saw developing. Local housing finance tools like TIF, housing improvement area, tax abatement, and bonds were something that communities really wanted to say that they would consider in certain circumstances, rather than a blanket statement of they were unlikely to consider it or likely to consider it. Many communities appreciated giving a little bit more guidance on what types of projects or places within their community they would be more likely to consider the use of these local finance tools. One fun surprise was that we found out that some local housing tools that we didn't think were as widely used are more widely used than we thought. Lots of other regional housing players in our region were surprised to learn that many communities, more than 30, currently have accessory dwelling unit code supportive of a mother-in-law flat either behind, next to or behind the house, which helped fuel some of the work that Family Housing Fund has created. So the requirements that we asked of communities not only bolster our work and our understanding at the council, but help support the work of other regional housing organizations within our sphere. And we also found out that many communities were interested in exploring their own local 4D program through this. I think if we hadn't asked them the question, we might not have found that information out otherwise. One other piece was that the housing tools section allowed really ambitious communities to chart a path to success. So early in their comprehensive plan process, Eden Prairie started talking about an inclusionary housing ordinance and used their comprehensive plan outreach process as a time to gain support for that notion. And now they have adopted a inclusionary ordinance within their community. So that's pretty exciting. Another thing that we plan to do is over time tracking the use and adoption of these tools, programs, and policies as communities move forward. We have an annual housing survey effort that we send out to the planners at each community and ask them which tools they have adopted by a date and which tools they've used by a last date. So we can kind of see how over time the implementation of this goes. And that's information that, again, is not only useful for us, for other organizations within our regional context. Next slide, please, Greg. This wasn't just a learning experience for us. These aren't just lessons that we learn, but it's something that cities learned a lot too. Seeing the affordability need breakdown in the bands of 30% AMI and below, and 31 to 50% area median income, and 51 to 80% area median income really led to some deeper conversations during the comprehensive planning process than we had seen before. Cities like Maple Grove and Bloomington used it to hone in on these specific AMI bands that they didn't know were cost burdened within their communities and that they wanted to serve. So some communities have taken this information that we presented to them during the comprehensive planning process and are blossoming into acknowledging and owning their role in housing outcomes for their residents. And also thoughtfully considering tools that they can use to meet these needs. If I could go back in time and tell 2018 Hillary one thing related to housing comp plan reviews, of course, it would be related to housing comp plan reviews. It would be to more ardently warn cities about squeaking by with just, 1 to 10 extra units of their land guided to affordable housing in their table. There have been a lot of communities that guided land really close to the line to be found consistent with a council housing policy that since have fallen out of consistency just because of a really small change to their plan. And that doesn't feel great. So that's something that I would encourage us to do differently next time. Documenting the community's policy intention has really been a challenge. Some communities prefer to have a very transparent process so that developers know exactly what support they can expect from a community. And other communities prefer to be a little less transparent, to bargain more with developers on a case-by-case basis in order to get what they want out of a development process. Still, other communities saw the opportunity to name their policy intentions with each tool as a way to consider the use of each tool in a way that they hadn't before. Pretty much every community, whether they were a documenting type of community or a bargaining type of community, this created more heartburn in their comprehensive plan adoption process locally than they were kind of expecting to go into. So I think this led to a lot of ire. How to accomplish both a process that is clear for developers and a process that allows for some healthy discretion in award of funds is difficult for communities. And as you know, we are also funders of projects on a through programs. And so we sympathize with the difficulty of deciding and naming those intentions. A question we get a lot from other organizations and housing spaces is if it was really worth it to have cities write down their policy intentions with housing tools. Will cities actually follow what are in theirs those comprehensive plans. So mixed implementation of what communities have written in their plans is something that we plan to watch again through those annual housing survey efforts, if they adopt information or not. Councilmember Lee, are you raising your hand? Would you like to say something?
Yes, thanks for that. I had a question, a quick question. If, if there are cities in this past round who had like great examples or projects relating to health equity or say greener energy around these areas, is there a place where we kind of show it off to other cities as an example? Like, could it be in like the planet handbook, or if there are really cool things like that, is there a way that we could share that moving forward too with other cities?
I'm going to pass this one off to Lisa. I know like within the housing sphere a little bit about that, but I think Lisa's going to have a better answer.
Thanks, Hillary. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Lee, we do share on our local planning handbook and have shared out in some of our newsletters over the years a section on our handbook called Local Planning Highlights, where we're sharing out exactly that. We didn't use a fancy name, we just called it what it is, highlights around local planning issues. And that's everything from cool housing things that local governments might be doing to some great stormwater treatment, complete streets things, transportation planning, health equity. There's a number of different items and topics on there. We have been obviously a little more focused on comp plans in reviewing those in the last couple of years, but expect to come back to highlighting all of the great work we've been seeing in plans now that we're coming out of reviewing all of those and sharing those out again on a more regular basis. But happy to share that link with the group as well if you haven't had a chance to dig in there. I can share that out after our meeting.
Oh, that's great. Thanks.
Next slide, please, Greg. We're just starting internally, as you might have noticed. I don't think Lisa's alone in saying 2050 when she meant 2040. We as staff are starting to think about writing the regional development guide for the 2050 plans. So we're already thinking about what the next decade's regional housing policy might look like. So in that vein, we're thinking about what would we do differently next time. Keeping it simpler for smaller communities is a bar none thing that we should have done with housing and that I look forward to doing next time. When communities have a need that's less than about 20, and we should think more about exactly what that number is in the future. That's something we want to investigate more. Doing land guided for affordable housing means a little bit less. When communities had a need of, say, like 3 to 5, even in this round, we kind of allowed for an exception where if a community came up with a very detailed process of how they would meet their need of 3 to 5 units, either by working with an outside partner, saving up general funds to help with the development. That was more meaningful, honestly, than land guided for affordable housing at that scale. So that's something that we want to focus on for next time. I don't think housing is alone in that kind of consideration. Over communicating, it's like location for developers over communicating for regional housing planners. I think that next time we can do a lot more work on not only showing how to do it, which we created some examples this time, but budgeting out how long it might take to do this type of work. I think the issue for a lot of communities was not telling the story to their planning consultants about how much time this might take. And so that led to a lot of frustration. Recalibrating the tools requirement. Housing is a little unique among other areas in the comprehensive planning process, and that we are laser focused on the next 10 years instead of the next 30 years, how almost every other area of comprehensive planning is. And I think the tools requirement really reflects that difference. We're asking communities to think deeply about implementation in a way that in other areas of the plan they aren't. So there might be some good, right sizing work there, telling communities that don't normally do this type of work, that it would be acceptable to do this outside of the planning cycle instead of as part of all of this other really in-depth work that they're doing. The last piece that we want to explore a little bit more and would welcome any comments on is how to help local local communities consider their regional housing needs in concert with their neighbors. We know that housing markets, we do have housing submarkets, but it's a regional beast. So we need communities to consider how they would work together in order to meet these needs. Often overlapping government boundaries like school zones really impact a community's housing landscape. So that's something we would like to highlight more next time. And that is my last content-filled slide. So I will open up for questions about this presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Hillary. And we already have some questions. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first of all, I wanted to ask about in the tools requirement. I heard from several cities that there was frustration of saying for a 10-year period, a tool or a selection of tools, because things are always changing and elections will change the ideology of councils, every 2 or 4 years. And so then if you have a change of heart about something, you have to do a comp plan text amendment, just be, and frustration that they had to put that into a comp plan where they didn't feel like it was necessary to lock in tools for 10 years at a time, or else have to, you know, do extra paperwork to change it through us if things changed. Can you comment on that?
We heard the same, thank you, Councilmember Wolf and Chair Zelli. We heard the same thing from many communities, that they didn't appreciate having to put something down in writing, and that operating with a little bit more flexibility was more their style. I do not think that a text amendment would necessarily be required in order to start using a tool if a community said that it was unlikely that they would use a tool. We suggested to communities to use language that gave a clear indication, but that did not box them in, right? As a planning document, we don't want to prescribe pretty much anything in the document, but we do want to give developers a clearer idea of what is likely to be on the table, or what is likely to be on the table given some considerations, and what isn't. The reason, and Tara can speak more to this after I finish if she has anything to add, but one of the reasons we decided to add the kind of level of consideration that a city would give any given tool is because of our work during the last housing policy plan writing process. We heard from developers that the level of clarity was so different across communities that it made it hard to even approach a conversation about what might be used at the local level to support affordable housing development. So we kind of took that on as like well, we can help solve this one. I think in some ways, the way that it was implemented, we burned a lot of social capital in the process of doing it. So we're still kind of figuring out if it was worth it. But I'll open it up to Tara to add anything.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Wolf, yeah, I don't have much to add. Hillary had it really well. It's another one of those balances we're trying to strike where we don't kind of allow communities to not acknowledge there are tools that could be used to achieve, very important housing goals. But at the same time, it was never intended that they have to be boxed in by it, that they use very general language that just sort of gives an indication of the intention. And we were very much thinking about how do you word this in a way where changes in administration and political leanings don't render the plan kind of inaccurate or false. So we tried really hard to massage the language, but like Hillary said, and very much appreciate your feedback right now, not sure we got the balance entirely right. And so want to work on improving that for the next cycle.
Well, absolutely. With the changing, everything is changing continually right now, faster than anybody could possibly have imagined. So more flexibility is generally better than less. I also heard from communities that they were afraid that they would be judged. Like if you didn't say yes to every single thing, that, the council wouldn't want to give them grants and whatnot, and they felt like maybe they were being coerced. So perhaps that's part of the communication. The other thing that came up is that frequently the land that actually does get developed for affordable housing is not the land that's zoned for higher densities. It ends up being so expensive that developers buy an underutilized parcel in some other zoning classification and then rezone it for the affordable housing. And I even have one right now going on in Lakeville. There was a very large parcel that was zoned for high density. It was purchased by a church and zoned to something else, lower, still residential, but lower density. And the church built and did a bunch of expansions, but now they're rezoning some of that land back to high density so they can put affordable senior housing and other things in the mix on their property. But I think we need to acknowledge that that list that they give and even the changes along the way don't necessarily give a really clear view of what land is actually possible to develop for affordable housing, because it doesn't get changed until somebody picks up that underutilized parcel and redevelops it.
Great conversation. And Hillary, so I have a question. You've stated we're doing a survey to actually understand what tools are being deployed. And in that process, are we kind of evaluating their effectiveness? And is there a sense of how we learn over the past? And I have a more specific question, only because I was in a conversation with a former housing commissioner who will remain nameless, but she said housing trusts aren't effective, and I didn't have any data to say that they are. Are they widely spread? And is this the kind of thing we should be knowing about?
Thank you, Chair Zilli, for the questions, and thank you, Chair Wolf, for the further clarification of your points.
I got promoted to chair. Woohoo!
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yay!
Didn't mean to pull the chair out from under you, Chair Zilli.
No.
So the second part of your question was about local housing trust funds. I think the idea of local funds going towards affordable housing development was in a different place 10, 15 years ago when communities started talking about developing local housing trust funds. And now they're in a place where some local housing trust funds at the local level have been used a little bit more as a political bargaining tool, where pass-through funds from the federal government are counted as part of the local housing trust fund, even though those are funds that the community would receive anyway. And so I would think, not only among unnamed former housing commissioners, but through many in the public, they see a local housing trust fund as a term that has lost meaning. What it worked, I think, effectively to raise the profile of was the need of local investment in affordable housing, and I think it has succeeded there. So, and I'm sorry, you'll have to remind me the first part of your question.
Well, just that we're doing these, getting a greater understanding of what tools are being deployed, and maybe is there a way to measure their effectiveness in the process?
Yeah. So in our annual housing surveying effort, where we ask communities, what tools have you been using? When did you start using a tool? When did you finish using a tool? We are also asking them a couple of open-ended questions about what housing challenges are you experiencing right now, and what is working well? Like, where are you seeing success in your own efforts? And we have found a way to make those questions required for participation in LCA. So I think we'll get some pretty good answers. And that'll help us buff out the story, not only of like when a tool is used and there was some development, was there any connection, but also kind of like the narrative storytelling piece is something that we're hoping to capture through that survey effort. I really appreciate the question. Thank you, Chair Zilli.
Great, thank you for that. And Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Hillary, for doing this work. I really, really appreciate it, and it's fun, even having now been out of city government for a little bit, to see how it continues to evolve forward, because this was really important. It's important work for everybody, but I enjoyed working in housing and our comp plan stuff. So I just want to kind of piggyback on a couple of things that Councilmember Wolf said. I know too that you know, in Plymouth our comp plan would get approved, and we, you know, meet all of the zoning densities that we needed, guiding densities that we needed. But I would also say that I think we'd have, it was hard sometimes. We'd have housing advocates that would say, why aren't you guiding this to higher density? And sometimes we would purposefully leave properties that we thought might really work well for affordable housing, but we wanted the developer to really prove to us before we would just grant a change to higher density that it would be for affordable housing, because we were learning very rapidly that you could have higher density and they could come in with extremely non-affordable housing, right? So we were trying to keep all of the tools in our quiver to work with developers to incent them to work with us on affordable housing before that we'd give up our highest authority as a city council. So there's that. And I think it'll be interesting as we move forward, and just again, really appreciate your work. I want to learn more about how tools are evolving. And I know especially, I came out of a meeting with the Municipal Legislative Commission, their legislative breakfast, I think that was last week. And it was also just really interesting to hear how they are really working very hard at the local level on affordable housing, what the hurdles are for them right now. And they believe that the game, and we know this to be true, is to really preserve the naturally occurring affordable housing, which we're losing at a fast clip right now. So it's an all fronts attack right now, I think, to get this done. But you know, I just am grateful for the work that you're doing and how we can then come in support of those local communities as they're trying to be innovative and come up with whatever works. So thank you.
Great comments. Thank you. Any other thoughts, questions? Councilmember Sterner, sorry.
Thank you, Chair Zelle. Hillary, I just had maybe a few eclectic questions for you, or like having a dialogue with you. But when they have some of these housing, like when is enough housing enough? You're like a couple of cities close to me, you know, there's not many green spaces left. They've done a lot of high density stuff. So, you know, when do they need to keep turning more housing units in? That'd be like one of my first eclectic questions in that.
Thank you, Chair Zelle, Councilmember Sterner. The way that we chart growth in the region is through our forecast system. So we have decided that our affordable housing need designation is paired very closely to our forecasted growth. We calculate for the region how many households we think are going to need affordable housing, like what proportion of our growth we think is going to need affordable housing, considering just a few policy factors, and then allocate to communities based on their forecast growth. So if a community doesn't have a lot of opportunity for new development and they don't think that they're going to redevelop a whole lot, their affordable housing need is in line with that number. So for any community that is talking about like our growth doesn't feel in line, you know, that type of conversation, I would recommend they reach out to Todd Graham, who works on our forecasts here. Does that get at the heart of your question, Councilman?
Yeah, that gets to the first one. Can I ask a couple more, Chair Zelle?
Sure, please.
Okay, one of my next ones is like, you know, with trying to get the carbon footprint down and the affordability. Like I was just at a housing thing about a week ago with the cities, and they had like Lakeville was one of the cities in there, and their city manager was doing a presentation, and a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house, and not even like the great part of Lakeville was considered affordable. It was $468,000 for that house. It was just like incredible. So we kind of like talked about, I think before, like more affordable, like duplexes or tiny homes. things like that. And I'm also looking at energy effective homes, like where the homes could be, already have solar panels on them in such where that's part of the building code. Are there any grants or programs like that where we can, speed that up or allow builders to work on those type of things?
That's a great question. I don't have a wonderful answer for new construction of like energy efficient standards. Tara might. Tara, do you have any?
Oh, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Sturter, yeah, I share kind of Hillary's, this is, the intersection of kind of, climate resiliency and environmental impact and housing affordability is at times and at odds kind of tension. But at times we find solutions that kind of help pair things together, like our Solar for Vouchers program, which would of course address rental, not home ownership, like the example you were giving. So I think that's very much an issue, how to make those two very important things work together. And ideally we find solutions like Solar for Vouchers where kind of two needs are getting, are helping leverage each other. Because I think, what we know is that a lot of the efforts to make housing more green add upfront costs, even if they save long-term costs. So better quantifying that and building that into financing, really requires the full spectrum of folks in the housing industry and world, both in the private market and in affordable housing. So I kind of share Hillary's apology that I don't have a great answer for you, that it's a sticky wicket there, and we're constantly trying to think about how we can integrate those two really important policy goals together.
Okay, and then I just had one more question, and then I'm good for the evening.
Sure.
My last one has to do with when we're doing housing. Like green spaces are so important on the one side for park and recreation, where people can have their mental health and go to local parks, and on the other side, when we're raising food, it's important to have local agriculture and less trucking and looking. So I'm wondering, when you do housing, do we look at trying to preserve Ag 1 type land as well as our parks that typically are, code I know city with when they do housing, but I'm just kind of wondering, how does that work with your housing needs and what the cities come up with on their plans?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Councilmember Sterner, Chair Zelli. One thing that we are starting to think about more in earnest with our partners, with our colleagues in the Regional Parks Unit, is how do we provide meaningful, affordable housing opportunities near high quality green spaces? Most frequently, areas that are developed near high quality green spaces are super unaffordable. So a thing we're thinking about is how do we prevent things like green gentrification? How do we make sure that there are still affordable places able to live near green spaces? I am not the expert on this, but I know that the council has an agricultural preserve program to make sure that our expanding development and capacity for more residents in our region does not compete with high quality agricultural areas. I think that Lisa might be able to speak more to that. I did have one more thought when Tara was talking about answers to your question about energy efficient homes. One thing that I've heard from my friends who work more in the energy efficiency side of housing is that the lowest carbon impact house is a house that already exists. So something that we're focusing a lot of our efforts on is making existing housing more energy efficient. And I know that there are a lot of programs through Excel Energy and Centerpoint Energy and other utility providers in our region that support that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate the information and your work.
Great comments. Any other questions, comments at this point? Well, Hillary, I want to echo what has already been said. We're really deeply appreciative of your work, your presentation, and this continuing kind of exploration as we improve and we refine these processes, and looking forward to this next phase of the 2050 process as we get into it. So thank you so much for your presentation. We're going to now hear from on the subject growing shade, which is tree canopy planning in the region, and subject I'm really interested in. And I see Eric Rochick and Ellen Esch are here to make that presentation. So Ellen, Eric, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Really quick, I just thought, what a perfect segue. You know, Hillary ending that conversation talking about the intersection of housing and the need for green space. That's exactly what this, this project really looks at things like that. So um, I'm really excited to be here today. I think that this project that we're going to present to you is, I don't want to, I'm trying to be modest about it, but I do think it's going to really change the game when it comes to canopy planning at the local level. So we're really excited after a year of work on this that we've reached this point. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I'll ask everybody if you could just to hold the questions till the end. I just want to make sure that we get through the material, and we're quite happy to answer any questions you have. But if you could just hold on to those. Thanks for joining us. My name is Eric Wycheck. I'm a planning analyst in the local planning assistance work unit in community development here at the council. I'm joined today by Ellen Ash, senior data scientist in the research work unit, also in community development. We will be co-presenting on this new tool that we're calling Growing Shade. Growing Shade is a tree planting, canopy and enhancement and preservation tool. And you are our first audience, our first formal audience. So we're excited about this. Next slide, please. You see here, there we go. So today's discussion is going to focus on where this project came from. So the policy, the regional policy foundation of the project, and also the demonstrated need from stakeholders. We're going to discuss tree planting and canopy preservation as a sustainable solution to intersecting regional issues. We're also going to provide the background of the tool, how it was created, and then Ellen's going to demonstrate the various applications of the tool, and we'll finish with a discussion of ongoing training efforts and continued outreach. Next slide. To provide a little bit of context, regional tree canopy work started at the Metropolitan Council within local planning assistance. I believe Lisa Barajas remembers this well. She had this as part of her work plan, I believe, in 2015. We did do some early work on getting some canopy data from the U of M. That was a huge help to some of our climate work. But this data and this tool that we have today to present to you really takes it to the next level. And I'll explain why in just a moment. Next slide, please. We have to root and ground everything within regional policy. So I'm going to do that real briefly here. It can be argued that tree canopy planting, enhancement, and preservation spans all of the 5 Thrive outcomes within Thrive MSP 2040. But we're going to focus here on 2 outcomes that really form the foundation of the project, and that's sustainability and equity. Thrive MSP 2040 defines sustainability as protecting our regional vitality for generations to come. Trees play a big role in sustainability because a single tree is an expression of policy that can span several human generations. And we're going to return to that theme later too. In addition, we need to recognize that land use, environmental, and climate change policies affect groups differently. This project centers environmental justice considerations in the stories and within the tool. Environmental justice is achieved when everyone enjoys protection from environmental and health hazards. And Ellen's going to speak more specifically about this. Next slide, please. This slide provides a high-level summary of the information we wish to convey today, namely the purpose of the tool, which is to provide an interactive resource to inform tree canopy planting, enhancement, and preservation within our region. This tool responds to a need expressed from key stakeholders. We have heard from practitioners that they have limited resources and capacity, and this tool can help deliver a multitude of benefits for residents most in need. The tool includes stories from on-the-ground practitioners and tree advocates. The tool is also highly customizable and provides up-to-date information, which is critical given the challenges such as climate change and invasive species. The project is a collaboration between the Metropolitan Council, the Minnesota Nature Conservancy, and the Minnesota nonprofit Tree Trust. This project is ongoing, so there will be training and outreach opportunities throughout the coming months. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ellen to explain some of these intersecting issues. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for providing that policy context for the project, Eric. So as Eric alluded to, yeah, I'm going to explain the intersectionality between trees and regional issues. Next slide, please. So throughout the course of developing Growing Shade, we took a close look at 4 key issues that intersect with the tree canopy. Those issues are environmental justice, climate change, conservation of natural resources, and public health. So briefly, we know that trees are not distributed evenly around the region and that certain groups disproportionately face negative consequences of land use decisions. These facts underlie the overlap between trees and environmental justice. Climate change is another big issue facing our region. With rising temperatures and altered precipitation patterns, trees and other green infrastructure can be useful in mitigating some of these impacts. Trees also provide valuable benefits of sequestering carbon and providing habitat for biodiversity. Preserving the existing tree canopy and considering the value of natural resources and making land use decisions can help our region grow and change sustainably into the future. And finally, we know that trees are linked to better health of people. Trees improve both air and water quality and are linked to improve physical and mental health of residents. So growing the tree canopy and growing shade can help improve public health. And this map that you're seeing on the right is showing the relevance of these 4 key issues across our region, and the colors are indicating the highest priority issue in each census block group. The map's an overview, and local level issues, might be different, need a more tailored focus, and Growing Shade does allow for full customization and in-depth exploration of issues, which I'll get into soon, but please remember that stakeholder engagement is also critical. Next slide, please. So, thank you. So given that broad overview, I'm going to share some of the history behind the overlap of those intersecting issues and also provide recent data that shows how these issues are playing out on the ground today. So the first thing that we need to consider is that in our region and across the nation, racist policies and history have impacted today's environmental conditions. So in the Twin Cities, systematic seizure of indigenous lands and genocide occurred as Dakota and Ojibwe people were coerced into signing land cession treaties beginning in 1805. Within Growing Shade, we invite you to learn more with a perspective from the native-led Lower Failing Creek project. That group is using trees to help restore the Wakan Teepee site in St. Paul. And while the 200 years which have passed since the early 1800s, that's a time frame that spans multiple human generations, but this history is easily recorded within the single lifetime of one tree. So to me, this fact really is making poignant the profound impact that racist policies and history have had and continue to have in influencing today's environmental conditions. Black communities have also been disproportionately exploited and impacted by land use decisions and policies. Redlining was a government-sanctioned practice across the nation that started in the 1930s, and the maps on the right are showing which areas were redlined in Minneapolis and St. Paul. This redlining policy intentionally excluded Black families from home ownership and denied all access to capital in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Even with the end of redlining, racially restrictive housing covenants continued until the 1950s. Redlining has lasting consequences today, including lower tree canopy and higher temperatures in these areas. Creating infrastructure also negative consequences on minority communities with Black residents and businesses being displaced as I-35W and I-94 were constructed. Today, this leaves Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color disproportionately impacted by lack of trees and green space and having higher land cover of impervious surfaces. Pollutants from vehicle exhaust also bring respiratory health issues to communities which are situated along interstates. In Growing Shade, a story from St. Paul's Frogtown neighborhood explores these issues and one group's initiatives to plant trees to help promote a more equitable future. So in summary, all of these racist policies have long-lasting consequences, and it's why environmental justice is a key issue identified in this project. Of course, these issues outlined here are not unique to our region, nor is this a comprehensive list of environmental justice issues. So, I'll kind of note that it is encouraging to see researchers and media outlets start to uncover these stories nationally, and we're really pleased to add Growing Shade to the mix. But we also want to highlight that our project more precisely focuses in on our region's unique history in a way that generalized national trends or tools cannot. Next slide, please. So with that background, here are the data for our region which show disparities in tree canopy cover with income and race. In each of these plots, the roughly 2,000 census block groups across the 7-county region are plotted. So the panel on the left is showing that tree canopy increases sharply with household income up until the median annual income of an area is around $100,000. The panel on the right is showing that tree canopy decreases as the share of residents identifying as a person of color gets higher. And do note that these figures are showing tree canopy in 2021. So we're not talking history here. These are the conditions that are occurring on the ground today. Next slide, please. So to help illuminate these numbers a little bit, I've pulled out 2 examples here. On top, you can see an area from St. Paul's Summit Hill neighborhood. This is an area that has 42% tree canopy cover, a median household income of about $120,000, and 9% of residents identify as a person of color. The bottom example is from Minneapolis's Camden neighborhood. This area has less than half the tree canopy of Summit Hill. This Camden area also has half the median income, and about 6 times more residents identify as a person of color. And hopefully you can see these really stark differences in what the tree canopy is looking like. These pictures are taken on the same day. It's the same geography scale. And what I think is also interesting about this is that these 2 areas are sharing the same population density of about 13 people per acre. So this really isn't a population density issue. Next slide, please. Now, the inequities in tree canopy cover mean real consequences for temperatures. In 2017, an extreme heat tool was part of the climate vulnerability assessment for the region. The extreme heat tool shows differences of up to 40 degrees in land surface temperatures during a 2016 heat wave, and that's shown at the map at right. Now, these temperature differences have several drivers. First, the shading from trees and evaporative cooling from all vegetation can reduce temperatures. And then secondly, impervious surfaces and the heat generated from human activities. Think of vehicle engines that are running or air conditioning units. All of that can contribute to heat islands, which drive up temperatures in urban areas. Taking steps to reduce land temperatures is important because extreme heat is deadly. Adding trees can help reduce heat-related deaths. Baltimore in Maryland had a study done recently, and they showed that the existing tree canopy already prevents about 550 deaths each year in their city of 620,000 people. And granted, we have not done the research here, but if our region of 3.2 million people saw a proportionally similar impact, that would mean over 2,700 premature deaths prevented each year from just trees alone. Growing the tree canopy and reducing tree inequity could prevent more premature deaths. Vulnerability to extreme heat, in addition to considering variables related to the impact that trees can have on respiratory, physical, and mental health, is considered in Growing Shade's public health lens. Finally, climate change is underscoring the urgency of acting on extreme heat. On average, the Twin Cities currently have 13 days each year with temperatures over 90 degrees, but by 2050, we could see an additional 40 days over 90 degrees. In the climate change lens, In Growing Shade is considering the impact of extreme heat and identifies areas most at risk from climate change hazards. The climate change lens is also considering the risk of localized flooding, which trees can help mitigate via improved water infiltration. Next slide, please. Here's some data, and this is showing the relationship between summer land surface temperature during that heat wave and the amount of green space in our region. So areas with high amounts of green space, which include trees, remain substantially cooler during heat waves. Next slide, please. Here's Camden and Summit Hill examples again. So the Camden area with less green space had land temperatures around 97 degrees during that heat wave. And the Summit Hill area with more green space had a land temperature of about 94 degrees during the heat wave. And sure, this difference is only 3 degrees in land temperature, but please remember that a whole suite of other factors influence how humans are impacted by heat. The combination of temperatures, humidity, dew point, and air quality can all make the difference of a few degrees feel larger. The difference of a few degrees across the entire summer, not just during the heat wave, can mean it's more costly for people to cool their residences, for instance, by running air conditioner units if people are even having access to them. Not only may the total cost of electricity be higher, but given the lower incomes we see in Camden, that cost will proportionally be a much larger percent of people's total household income, which is dedicated to utility bills. And you can see how this can keep spiraling into a feedback loop where low income and residents of color are continuously left with disproportionately high burdens across the board. Next slide, please. So earlier I mentioned the impact of redlining on green space and temperature. And across St. Paul and Minneapolis, we're seeing the areas which had the A grade back in the 1930s. And I'm showing the grades on the y-axis. So the areas with the A grades are cooler today during heat waves. Areas formerly graded C or D, D corresponding to redline areas, those areas are hotter today. And the points that you're seeing in this plot show land temperatures during that 2016 heat wave, and the gray line in the middle is showing the average temperature of these areas. And this plot is really showing how past policy has ramifications today, and hopefully you're starting to understand that shade trees have the potential to be an important tool for changing these trajectories. And as a quick aside, it's not going to be a good solution to make top-down decisions to plant trees in certain neighborhoods where you might, think that they would be well suited. And there's a lesson from Detroit, Michigan, where the city tried that. But importantly, no one asked the residents what their opinions were of this plan. There's no plan for providing maintenance for the trees, no plan for involving residents and thinking about which tree species they might prefer. And overall, this project was not a success. So while the data on trees and inequities are powerful, stakeholder engagement is also critically important. And you'll see this continually emphasized in growing shade. Next slide, please. So the final issue I'll describe in more detail is the conservation of natural resources. But now, hopefully you're all starting to be convinced that planting new trees can be helpful, but growing shade means much more than planting new trees. It also means preserving existing mature trees so they can continue to grow and provide benefits. Unsurprisingly, mature trees offer more benefits than young trees. It takes time for trees to establish large enough canopies to provide shade. Mature trees are storing more carbon, and mature forests are more biodiverse and have bigger benefits on air and water quality. Our forestry partner that we worked with highlighted that getting trees to have trunks at least 18 inches in diameter is pretty critical to get these benefits. As for what a tree that big looks like, a tree that's 18 inches in diameter takes roughly my full wingspan to hug. Now, growing trees to maturity in the conservation of mature trees is often harder than planting new trees. Weekly watering of young trees is needed to help them establish. Dead trees certainly aren't going to be providing any community benefits, and moreover, it can be an eyesore and a safety hazard. Speaking of dead trees, emerald ash borer is an invasive insect which has or will kill every ash tree in our region without intervention. It's resulted in the removal of thousands of mature ash trees, and so it's certainly worth considering that, where practical, it could make a big difference to apply insecticides to keep mature trees in place, particularly in areas which already have low tree cover. Finally, new developments and suburbanization also threaten the health of existing trees and forests. And this is precisely why we have the conservation lens in growing shade, to provide a way to consider the importance of conservation and management of existing tree canopy. Next slide. Great, back to Eric.
Thanks so much, Ellen. And now you're probably wondering, well, okay, there is a policy foundation that directs us to do some of this work, but obviously, the Met Council, we're not experts in trees, so we need to partner to do this work, and that effective partnership has been with the Nature Conservancy here in Minnesota and Tree Trust. And early on, we had to really figure out, well, they had come to us saying that they wanted to do something with a tool, and we've been thinking about this for a long time because of our policy direction. where we had to really establish what is the need and what is the nature of that need for a tool. What does it look like? What are people really wanting? Next slide, please. So in early 2021, even before we were partnered on this, the Tree Trust and Nature Conservancy carried out a survey of forestry practitioners in the metro region, and they received 23 responses from a diverse range of community and county staff. This slide shows the 3 most common considerations in tree planting and maintenance, typically guided by tree replacement, tree diversity, and consideration of canopy gaps. This probably isn't a surprise to most people. Next slide, please. However, interestingly, they also asked the practitioners some other questions, and one of them was, what would they like to start considering when it comes to tree canopy planting and maintenance? And the respondents stated that they wanted to start planting in underserved areas. In other words, having those equity considerations drive the work, where lack of tree canopy can really exacerbate issues like urban heat, lack of biodiversity, pollution, and health issues. Next slide, please. Survey respondents also expressed interest in a tool that can generate reports, provides prioritization features, and illustrates how various issues interact with tree canopy planting or tree canopy planning. Next slide, please. So beyond the initial survey in early 2021, we also formed an advisory group to help guide us in scoping and developing the tool. This group consisted of participants from academic institutions, state agencies, city and county forestry, neighborhood advocates, and nonprofit practitioners who work in the tree space. And 6 focus areas emerged from this advisory group. Essentially, they wanted to incorporate neighborhood level voices in the tool. They also wanted to provide up-to-date data that could aid decision making, both at the site-specific level, but also at the community scale. So ensuring ease of access and clarity was also important. Providing data reports and customizable features at multiple scales, from block group to community to neighborhood. And also ensuring that audiences are varied and diverse. And then finally, and importantly, the data that this tool generates should be actionable. We should be able to take steps based on the data. Next slide, please. Once we had incorporated the early survey and advisory needs into the beta version of the tool, including the stories, it was time to test these out on stakeholders. So with the help of a University of St. Thomas marketing class, we administered a survey in November of 2021. We received 44 responses to the survey, and these were very helpful in determining if we were on the right path, if the tool was fit for purpose, and if the stories were sufficiently compelling. The feedback we received was really helpful in honing our message, enhancing accessibility and clarity, and demonstrating that we were largely fulfilling the need that had been expressed. Minor refinements and revisions were incorporated in December 2021 and January 2022. Next slide, please. When informed by our stakeholders and refined through testing, Growing Shade is a project of 2 key components, and this is probably the thing I'd really like you to take away from this. So the first component of the project is stories. And those stories help to educate users about different themes within the tool. We have 5 unique stories that are highlighted within the tool, and the stories are from Frogtown Green, which is an environmental justice and equity lens, Lower Phelan Creek Project, which is a Dakota and Indigenous perspective, Washington Conservation District, which focuses on conservation and climate change, Brooklyn Center Community Schools, which talks about youth involvement and education, and then Tree Trust, which focuses on the importance of tree maintenance. Next slide, please. The second component of the project is the mapping tool with prioritization and reporting functions. The mapping tool is fully customizable and creates data-driven reports at the city, neighborhood, and individual census block group level. These reports can be downloaded for easier sharing. Next slide. In summary, and to drive this home once again, Growing Shade is filling a key gap. It's fully customizable. It has a laser focus on issues in our region. It's highly actionable, and it provides up-to-date data. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to pass it back over to Ellen for the exciting part, which is the demonstration. Thanks.
So for the next portion, yep, I'm going to give this demonstration and use a couple case studies to do that. And please feel free to use the posted slide deck after this presentation to come back to these links in order to explore the tool yourself. Next slide, please. So first, let's look at the city of Bloomington. And a quick note is that all of the figures that you'll see in this case study, they're pulled directly from the interactive application. And these figures exist for all cities in the region and can be accessed by going to the application. Okay, so Bloomington has a tree canopy of about 40% throughout the entire city. And the top panel in this figure is comparing Bloomington's tree canopy to all other cities in the region. You can see Bloomington's coming in right about average. However, when we zoom in at a finer detail and look at the canopy cover within all block groups in Bloomington, and that's that bottom panel, we see that there's a huge variation in tree cover. Some block groups have as low as 10% tree cover and are likely in need of serious greening, while other block groups have over 60% tree canopy. Next slide, please. Earlier, I provided some details about how disparities in tree canopy exist with race and income, and you saw these same figures. Now, all the census block groups within Bloomington are highlighted in green, and you can see that these race and income inequities play out within a single city as well as across the entire region. Next slide, please. Moving into the different priority layers, here I've highlighted the geographical patterns found through 3 key lenses. Through the environmental justice lens, the northeast area of Bloomington is shown in dark red, which is indicating a high priority area for enhancing the tree canopy. This pattern is driven by the racial and income inequities shown in the previous slide. Through a conservation lens, the western area of the city, which is home to one of our regional parks, appears as a high priority for conserving the tree canopy. For all of our regional parks, we see that they are contributing substantial green space and value through the tree canopy. With a climate change lens, areas in central Bloomington and along the 494 corridor are high priority areas for greening. These are areas that are associated with a lot of impervious surfaces where trees can help reduce heat island temperatures and improve stormwater infiltration to reduce localized flooding. In this way of using the priority layers can be essential for planners, foresters, or even people writing or administering grants. And don't forget that all of this is highly customizable. As we were doing this project, we learned about one nonprofit project, which is working on greening school playgrounds. And for them, finding areas with high concentration of youth and high temperatures is critical. And this is possible within Growing Shade. Next slide, please. Finally, Growing Shade enables folks to translate concepts into action. Here's a map of the tree canopy from 2021 overlaid on Bloomington. And that tree canopy is shown in green. And in that bigger picture, I've zoomed into the northeastern part of Bloomington, where I circled 2 apartment complexes which occur there. And this map could, be used to help create a plan to enhance tree canopy in these sparse areas. This map can also challenge planners to think about creative ways to use trees to mitigate some of the air pollution impacts from 494, which is going to be at the top part of this map, where we see essentially no tree cover. Next slide, please. The same principles of using Growing Shade can be translated into evaluating site-level decisions and making plans. So here we'll look at another case study where I've zoomed in on a single block group. And this one happens to be in Minneapolis, where Metro Transit's Haywood campus is located. The aerial images show the construction of the new garage, which added impervious surface to the region and removed about a dozen trees, which I circled in red from the image in 2010. And while removing a couple trees seems insignificant, It is pretty shocking that this census block group has some of the lowest tree canopy across the whole region, less than 2%. And now that the Growing Shade Project is available to provide this type of information, we hope it sparks some hard questions. How could this property help contribute green space to the area? Are there ways to mitigate the impact of increased impervious surfaces? Having this information, would the development process have occurred any differently? Now, of course, neither Eric nor I have any answers here, but what we do have is a tool that everyone in our region can now use to start asking these questions. So we challenge you to think about these questions with other council land holdings or new acquisitions. Bring these data and this perspective to conversations that are happening in your respective districts. We hope that Growing Shade can help you understand the need to make places in our region healthy and resilient. Next slide, please.
Now I'm going to just quickly touch on what sort of outreach we're performing for Growing Shade. Next slide, please. So like I said, you are our first audience, so go easy on us. I'm just joking. You can ask us any questions you like. After this, we are going to be before some forestry practitioner audiences too. So we've got the Minnesota Shade Tree Advisory Council. We're going to present to them on February 17th. We're also presenting at the Minnesota Shade Tree short course in March. And then we have a planet implementation webinar for regional local planners toward the end of February. Next slide, please. But our work doesn't stop with trainings and webinars. So we're going to be providing or producing a promotional video that will be out hopefully in March 2022. We're also going to have a training video similar to this session, which will essentially walk people through the tool and how to use it and the sort of applications that they could use it for. We're also going to have a Planet panel discussion, speaking to practitioners who have used the tool for different reasons. And then we'll have train the trainer events because Ellen and I can't do all the training. So the idea is that if we can train a lot of people to use the tool and they feel comfortable with it, then they'll be training other people, which will be great. And then we'll have some media events occurring in April of 2022 around Earth Day and Arbor Day. Next slide. That brings us to the end of our presentation. I'd encourage you to jump on those links and have a look at the tool, but we're happy to take any questions you might have. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric and Ellen. And this is really exciting. And I've already jumped in and I'm looking at the tool. And of course, now we all have questions. Let's jump in. I see Councilmember Venta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In 8th grade, my classmates and I all had to memorize the poem Trees by Joyce Kilmer. And to this day, it's one of my favorite poems. And it fits because I'm a real zealot when it comes to tree preservation. I want to point out a couple of things. Councilmember Lee's brothers, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Councilmember Lee, were a part of a crew of wonderful volunteers who played a really important role in assisting the Lower Phelan Creek Project in cleaning up the sanctuary. And I think it points out not only is the sanctuary the land of the indigenous, but it's also land that is improved and walker and visitor friendly due to many other members of the BIPOC community and the Caucasian community as well. They just have did a tremendous job down there and really made a difference in making the sanctuary where the Walk-in Teepee Center will soon be located. I also want to note that a very generous donor of the National Park Trust, which is based in DC, donated, I want to use a figure, but I'm not going to because I don't want to have to correct the minutes, but a very generous donation of trees to the sanctuary. And I believe this donor is from Texas. Now, what his link was to the sanctuary and how he came to know about the just treasured important history of the sanctuary is unknown to me, but I think it just shows that there's a lot of community interest in preservation of green spaces, and in particular preservation of trees. And with regard to coming events and promotion, there is a past event that really got me excited about the presentation tonight. And that's when I happened to be paying attention to the evening news one night, and I saw Eric in Frogtown doing his work there with the folks. It was just tremendous, Eric. So to both of you, thank you very, very much for this work. I am interested in the train the trainers. So great plan, totally comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Let's go to Councilmember Fredson.
Thank you. Fascinating presentation. I just had a question about Emerald Ash Borer. I'm wondering if you could say more. I'm curious to know if we know what percent of the trees in the metro are ash borer, and then if you mentioned insecticide. I guess I have 2 large ash trees in my yard, and sort of fearing the day when they need to be removed or they just come down. But you mentioned insecticide, and my understanding is, I put shots in my trees, but they're not really savable, right? And so then what, do we know what the impact is going to be just in terms of, is there like mapping of ash trees across the metro too?
I can take that. Thanks, council member. Yeah, good observation. So for the ash trees, in some communities that have done surveys of the biodiversity and which species are in like public right of way, in some instances we see numbers up to 40% or higher. And so that's huge, and that's not even considering like people's backyards, which are not in that public domain, if you will. And just like kind of informally, as I was doing all of the building the machine learning model that identified the tree canopy in 2021, I was cross-referencing a bunch of training points which came out of where tree canopy was identified in 2015, and about 20% of the areas which should have been trees were not trees 7 years later. And so that really drives home the point that Eric and I and the decisions that we've made in order to really be temporally accurate here. Of course, there's some trade-offs with that, and we invite you to read some of the FAQs and the methods in the tool. But yeah, emerald ash borer can be really catastrophic. And in that growing shade tool, there's also a tab on other resources, and we definitely direct you there. Some of the partners that we work with are experts in knowing how emerald ash borer has and will continue to impact the region, and what are some interventions that can be done. But neither Eric nor I are arborists, and so the best information is not going to come from us. But we do provide an aggregated spot where other resources that might be useful.
Great, thanks. How about Councilmember Lee?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just want to say a quick commendation to both of you for this great presentation. It's a very powerful reminder that aside from being policymakers who are responsible for stewarding the built environment, our very, very sacred duty is also to steward the natural environment, whether it's cleaning water before we send it back to the Mississippi because our state is the headwaters, or doing amazing things like replenishing the tree canopy. It's really important work. So thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate all of this work. It's fascinating that we've gotten to the point where we've got these tools that can show us, how to manage some of the problems that we're facing, and I'm sure local governments will appreciate it. I know the city of Plymouth, for probably well more than a decade, maybe even going on 15 years or more, have been dealing with emerald ash borer. I just all want you to know, maybe you all know this, but when it gets to 30 below in real temps, it kills off the emerald ash borer. So when it's really frigid outside, just know Mother Nature is doing good work on our behalf. A couple of things that relates to tree canopy, and these are just some interesting anomalies that I'm wondering if they were included in the study. So Camden is part of my history. I used to live there for quite a while and was very active. But we had that terrible tornado that ripped through in 2011. It hit Theodore Worth and then shot up through Jordan, which was, I think, most severely impacted, but so was Camden. And then it flew off over into, hit Golden Valley and then flew off to Fridley. So as we look at the aerials now, clearly when you lose that much canopy, when in an incident like that, trying to restore it and get it back to where it needs to be is a big task. And I don't know what they've done as far as tree restoration in that area, but when you lose the mature trees, you have to come back with the little itty bitty trees that, none of us will probably live long enough to see it be the big tree, but that's the process. So I was curious about that. The other thing too is, we touched on this a little bit earlier in our housing discussion. And I remember, as much as I love trees and the environment and did, great conservation work in Plymouth and set aside property that was just for tree canopy and a little bit of human interaction through some trails. When we were going to put housing in, though, trees had to go in order to get the infrastructure in. And, we've got some of the big woods out here in Plymouth and those had been touched. So it was a real dicey situation when you're trying to provide for housing, trying to provide for affordable housing, and knowing that in order to build and be part of this urban area that we're planned for, you're going to have to sacrifice, unfortunately, trees. With that said, though, the city forester was always working at, tree replacements, again, the itty bitties, but also disease and pest tolerant, so that we aren't planting the same thing that gets hit over and over again. We've got more diversity in our trees. So I'm just, and also with density, you've got big swaths of impervious surface. And so I think most units of local government, cities, are also working on that, because then of course you get the runoff problems that go into the wetlands that eventually go into the Mississippi, and you can't filter out the pollutants. And that's why the Clean Water Act has communities building, I think after 1970 something, or maybe it's in the 80s, the National Urban Runoff Program, the ponds that have to filter it all out. So, in order to balance all of that, trees have been lost. So new trees get put in. So I'm hoping that as we look at tree canopy, maybe we can't see the itty bitty trees that have been planted that, in 50 or 100 years will be there for us. And then last but not least, I think I just want to say too, that when we do come in with our transportation corridors, it is pretty rare that you get any, and we've got a MnDOT commissioner here, but it's pretty rare that you're able to find any sort of extra monies to do the beautification in the rights of way as it relates, to trees or otherwise. So I appreciate that this might be able to inform some of those policies as we, even at Met Council with the work that we're doing, are able to maybe even legislatively address what grant money might be out there or other pots of money that might be out there when these projects are coming in. So just a couple of my thoughts. Simply, again, I appreciate this work very much. And yet I know that, there are just unfortunately competing interests at hand. But eventually I think the values that Minnesotans put on trees and replacing trees, hopefully this tool will help us get where we need to be, whatever those hurdles might be.
Great comments. Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. And you should note that a former commissioner of MnDOT started a program of conservancies to match local funds to establish trees along MnDOT right away. So let's see. Let's go to Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councilmember Johnson brought up many of the things. I had the same thought about Camden. It's like, yeah, that looks like trees have been replaced after a tornado. But I would also observe that a lot of the things in this tool are more relevant for places that have been fully developed for some time versus places that are developing. In the emerging suburban edge, for example, or suburban edge, the tree canopy is generally more related to the age of the home than it is to any other factor. When I built my house, I had itty bitty trees, and now I have a couple of 50-foot willows in the backyard that are probably 3 feet in diameter, not circumference, diameter. But you know, so it doesn't take 50 or 100 years to get big trees necessarily, but if anything, it's an inverse relationship between uh, income and tree canopy, because as the price of land has gone up, the lots have gotten smaller, requiring clear cutting everything in order to grade it is in many lots as you can. And then you put a huge house on there, and then you plant your little trees around, which is good for the health of the trees, because if you plant trees that are 2 inches in diameter or less, they're more likely to grow and thrive than if you try to plant a 4-inch or bigger diameter tree. I learned that the hard way. We thought we were going to be so great and get this 4.5-inch diameter tree and plant it in our backyard. And all of the little baby trees, I grew one from a seed that is bigger than the one that I put in that was 4.5 inches in diameter, because it's just that, you know, reality of how trees grow. But it was interesting. I was playing with the tool while we were, you know, hearing the presentation, and it was interesting to look at how it works. But it is definitely more relevant in places that have been developed for quite some time than it is in the suburban areas that are experiencing significant growth.
Go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, well, thanks, Councilmember Wolf and also Councilmember Johnson. Yeah, I think that both of you brought up some really good points. And trade-offs is a word, right, that, you know, was used. And I think that there are, you know, this tool does enable us to look at trade-offs, and having an inventory and having this information is, you know, like the tool is not going to give you any answers. None of the analyses that go in the back can give you any answers. But knowing where we're at right now, today, is so important for having these conversations about trade-offs, right? And that's so important, or we heard that from our stakeholders, was super important to build in that prioritization piece, so that we can, with limited funds and limited time, you know, our partners can start to figure out, okay, if I only have X number of trees I can plant, you know, where can I think about, you know, reaching out to people that have land in these areas, or where some good opportunities might, in order so that I can do the best, that have the biggest impact with what I have there. And Eric, I don't know if you wanted to touch on some of the tornado impacts. I know that you've done some great work around there with other tools as well.
Well, I really appreciated what Councilmember Johnson said about when it's -30, because my wife gets so annoyed when every time it's -30, I said, this is killing the insect, you know, and she's like, I don't care about that, it's too cold, you know. But I think that we first actually noticed the effect of the tornado actually came to light really clearly when we did the extreme heat map first, and it was only by seeing, you know, I remember looking at North Minneapolis, because I knew that had happened in 2011, and there it was. It was actually showing up in the heat because the trees were gone. So it was kind of like an inverse way to get at that information. But then lo and behold, when you look at the trees, they're not there. So really interesting points. And you know, I think Ellen made a really good point about trade-offs. You know, like we've said throughout this presentation, it's about giving people, arming them with the data to make those hard decisions. You know, obviously sometimes we have to take trees down to develop. But one thing that, to go back to what Councilmember Wolf said too, one thing we're hoping that this might help communities in the urban fringe and emerging suburban communities is looking at natural resources fragmentation. So where there are currently stands of healthy mature trees, how can we make sure that we're creating subdivisions in such a way that we can preserve where we can and create those habitat corridors? You know, we're hoping that the tool will help with some of that as well. Thanks.
Thanks. I think we have Councilmember Sterner.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a few comments. I won't be too long with it. Some of the comments were made, but I think like Ellen, you brought up about the emerald ash borer be a tree, but like before that, we had to deal with the Dutch elm disease and the oak wilt, and it seems like we get away from these trees and then suddenly we clear cut them, and then we don't look at planting them. But now we've got elms that are Dutch elm resistant and things like that. So I think it's important when we do the tree program that you had some great comments about having choice with people to choose the trees. So I think the variety of trees is good. And I also think we should be looking also at nut and fruit trees, which will help some of our food supply and things with food and generate that as well in our communities. The last things I thought was what the other benefits that we have for having the tree is by lowering the heat. It also like my way back in the day as a sociology major, but usually like more violence is usually shown by the hotter it is outside. So I think by being cooler, it might help our communities in crime and violence, as well as being a noise barrier for not only taking the air pollution in the air, but also be a noise buffer like we do with our houses and on our air flight lines and everything. So I thought those are good actions as well. And I think the also key is by going with these organizations. I know like another one, I think you already have some, but like companies like Great River Greening, what they do about the education thing. So about when you prune the trees, like I just saw a crew out pruning today. A lot of trees you prune them in January is the best for most trees, but just that kind of education and watering and making sure people are taking care of that resource, I think is a really big thing. So I'm very excited about this. I've taken several vacations just to go see trees and that. So I'm excited about having some things. I don't have to go far to see great trees in our neighborhoods. So appreciate the work.
Well, just building on that, I think your presentation describing lessons learned from Detroit, we can't just have a program to plant trees. It is about engagement. It is about buying in, maintain, to take care of young trees, especially. And that's, I guess we see this tool as much awareness building, planning, starting this dialogue. Does this take I mean, I see it, and we're going to all kind of probably spend some time looking at it. Is this something that needs to be maintained on a regular basis? Is it, are we supporting it? Is it part of our Met Council website now permanently? Where will this go?
I can speak to that. Yeah, thanks for the comment, Sharon. I think that the permanence of this is really important to discuss. And there is a page on our website, metcouncil.org/growing shade will bring you to the page from which you can access that interactive tool. Yeah, this data, there are multiple data sources which go into the back end of this. And I'm sure all of you are well aware of the challenges around a lot of the census data over the past couple years. But any of those variables on people come from census. And so whenever new census data is finally pushed out, that lets us get down to that small geography level of Black groups. We'll incorporate that. We're really hoping to continuously update the tree canopy as well, because our region is, there's a lot of pressures on the tree canopy, and there's also a lot of people doing good work on the ground to try to grow that canopy as well. And so we want to, really, really have that temporal accuracy.
Excellent. Well, any other questions, comments for Eric, Ellen, others? There's the link in the chat. Well, I just will kind of say again how impressive this is. And we know this didn't just happen. I've certainly spoken to you in the past about our canopy programs, but this seems to be such an important element for where we can be as council members, partners, as you engage. We need to be kind of using this and amplify it and put a spotlight on it. So really, really appreciate your fine work. And we'll stay tuned. We'd love to have updates as to how some of this future engagement work turns out. Having said that, the sun has set. I'm looking out at my trees, and they look cold, like that ash borer is being All those bad insects are being driven away. Any other thoughts, comments for the day? Well, thanks everybody. This is a really interesting session, and I love that with all the other things we're doing, this seems so positive, and I really appreciate that this is important work, and the intersectionality and everything else we care about is so important too. So great to see you all. Take care, and we'll see you someplace soon. Thanks. Bye-bye. This meeting adjourned.
Thank you. Bye-bye.